How many of you feel like you're not in control of your emotions? How many of you feel like your emotions control you? If this sounds like you, this video is for you. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. I'm so glad that you guys are here. If you're new, welcome. Make sure you go ahead and click that subscribe button. It really helps me out a lot. Before we get into today's video, I just wanted to quickly announce that spots for my free consult have opened up. So if you'd like to schedule that, make sure you go ahead and use the link down below and get on that. If you're wondering who this consult is for, it is for people who have lost connection with themselves, who feel like they can't control their emotions, who feel like they have lacked confidence and they're trying to get that confidence back. This consult is really guided towards parents, as is my channel. If you're new to this channel, what I typically talk about is, again, some of those similar concepts. So whether it's connection, social and emotional learning, dealing with grief and loss, things like that, those are going to be the main concerns and the areas that I typically focus on. And as you can see by the title, in today's video, we're going to be talking about emotional control and how do we regulate our emotions. Before I get into that, I want to just quickly point out that the reason that we can't control our emotions is because we find it hard to recognize and identify our emotions. And as you'll understand later throughout this video, that the first step in order to influence or control our emotions, we really need to be able to identify them, to identify when we are in an emotional state. And again, I'll get into that. But typically we don't feel comfortable identifying our emotions because we either feel uncomfortable expressing emotion. Maybe it was some limiting belief we had in our childhood. Sometimes we think it's inconvenient to talk about emotions, especially when around others. Other times we even feel like we don't want to express specific emotions, whether that's because, again, those limiting beliefs, or it's because society tells us not to. So in either case, we typically fall into two patterns. We either stop expressing the emotions or we repress it and hide it with a different emotion. In either case, we have lessened our ability to recognize emotion. And I just want to quickly point out that an emotional state has two parts. So the state is something that we feel physiologically. So it's the feelings and sensations in our body, whether that's that tight chest or the knot in our stomach, sweaty palms, the feeling of hotness in our body. Those are the physiological sensations that we feel. But the emotion part is the interpretation of our mind. So it's the psychological thought or label that we put on those sensations that we then go into giving it an emotion. So I also want to talk about this little diagram that you see here. Now it kind of looks a little bit complicated, but basically what you have here is you have that state. So those are the sensations that you feel. And that state is perceived by our body or by our mind as something that we can interpret as a feeling. So a feeling of anger. So if we feel the heat in our body, if we feel like our head's pounding, we interpret that and we create that emotion. So just to go into a little bit more detail, I'm going to get a little sciencey on you guys, but basically what happens is that a situation occurs and we interpret that situation. So we give it a thought. A thought occurs in our mind. And once that thought occurs, it then gives into the state. So the state, the sensations that we feel in our body, the physiological things that occur inside the body. But those sensations then again get interpreted into a label. So we put meaning on those situations, or on those sensations rather. And then that gets interpreted into emotion. So if you think about this long process that happens, there are multiple steps involved to getting to that emotion. But oftentimes, our society thinks emotions are things that we have and something that just happens to us. But it's really not the case. If you think about it, the diagram that I just showed you and those steps that are involved, it's really not a thing. It's not an object. It's a process. The term emotion is actually a verb, so it's a moving process. But again, our society just thinks, just the way that we were brought up, an emotion is a thing. It is something that we have, and oftentimes we think it controls us. So when we put that meaning onto emotion, when it's just something that we have, we give it the power to control us, because that means that's something that it just puts onto us. But when you think about it as a process where there are multiple steps involved in which you are a part of, those interpretations, those thoughts, those labels that you put on it, it really gives you that power back. And I want to talk about power for a second. in order to get our power back, we need to recognize when we are in an emotional state. We also need to know what that emotional state is. Is it anger? Is it frustration? Is it stress? Is it anxiety? We then need to know what to expect from our bodies. How does our body react to these sensations or these feelings or thoughts or interpretations that we have? Only then can we use it to influence a new emotion, a new emotional state. So again, if you're just simplifying this process of emotion into a simple word, you're losing all the meaning that it can have. You're losing that power and that control that you can have over that interpretation. So really, to get behind this, and in order to influence our emotions, we really need to be able to recognize our emotions. So we kind of need to get out of that negative thinking pattern that we shouldn't be able to express emotion. We should fear expressing emotion. We shouldn't express specific emotions. We need to get out of that. Because in order to gain our power back and not feel a slave to our emotions, we need to recognize what's happening internally. If we recognize what's happening at each step of the way, if we recognize why we're giving meaning to these thoughts, why we're putting labels on these certain sensations that are happening in our body, for what reason? If we can understand what happens at the very start of the process, when that situation occurs, when we interpret that situation, if we can influence that, we can influence the emotion. If we can put a different meaning on something, we can influence the emotion. If we can ignore, per se, those sensations that are happening in our body, if they're not dangerous, of course, then we can influence the emotion. But the key is always awareness. You have to be aware of what's occurring in your body. What are the thoughts that you're having? You have to ask yourself the questions, why am I putting meaning onto this? Is this serving me? How do I know what I'm feeling? What are my sensations that are happening? If you can intercept at each point of the process, you can influence your emotion. You can let go of those negative beliefs that you have. If it helps, what I like to do is I like to journal about them. I like to ask myself these questions. If I'm feeling stressed on a particular day, if I'm feeling anxious, if I'm feeling angry even. It's hard to really stop what you're doing, take a minute and journal it. So what I do is every single day in the morning, I'll pretty much dump all of my worries or frustrations or feelings of anger that I'm having and just let it all go. But as I'm in a situation and as I'm feeling angry, I can ask myself those questions, because it's hard to just stop what you're doing and start to write about it. Like, who has the time for that, right? But if we can ask ourselves these questions along the way, we can give more awareness to it. And once we become more aware, we can influence it. So this is not to say that you can completely have control over your emotions. That's not going to happen. And there are going to be those days when, you have an outburst. Like, it still happens to me. It's always a learning process. And I'm learning more and more about my emotional thinking every single day. Every single time I write those worry dumps. Every time I write about it, the things that are happening externally, I can understand myself more internally. That's why journaling is such a powerful technique, and that's why I use it, and I always talk about it on this channel. But just to recap, what we just talked about is the reasons that we feel so uncomfortable identifying our emotions, the reasons we can't identify our emotions, really. We also talked about the importance of identifying our emotions, how it's the first step in taking our power back. I also pointed out that emotion is a process. It's not a noun, rather it's a long series of steps that you actually have control over, whether that's psychological or physiological control. So the next time you think about an emotion, next time you're in an emotional state, ask yourself those questions. Ask yourself if I'm putting meaning on it. Ask yourself if it's serving you. So that's all for this video, and I hope you guys thoroughly enjoyed it. And don't forget to share this video if you found it useful. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. So if you do have questions, comments, concerns, make sure you comment those down below and we can start a conversation on this, because I'd love to know what you guys have to say. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.